In this video, we're going to be replacing the ball joint in this 2005 Honda Element. To remove our wheel, it's going to be a 19mm socket. I'll take our wheel off now. So our backing plate here is pretty well rusted and corroded. We're just going to make it go away. We're going to remove our caliper. We have two bolts, top and bottom. They're going to be 14mm. At this point, when we have both of these bolts broken free, we're going to make sure we have some kind of hanger ready to hang our caliper on to keep stress off of the brake line or the brake hose. Sometimes these calipers will come right off the brakes. Sometimes you'll need to get in here and pry them off. This one slid off no problem. So what we can do is take our hanger, swing it around here, and we're going to hang it right on the spring, up and out of the way. Now we can see our pads. I'm going to remove our spring hardware. Just squeeze and remove. And our pads. Our pads should pop straight out. Same thing on this side. Now to remove our caliper, we have two bolts on the back. They're going to be 17mm. We did switch over to our breaker bar because these are going to be heavily torqued in. Now at this point, we can remove our caliper bracket and set that aside. So now the only thing holding our rotor in place would typically be two screws, Phillips screws. We have one missing. We do have one still here. We're going to use an impact driver here to try and break that screw free. Just going to see if it will turn by itself, and it won't. So as you hit this, it's going to turn that Phillips screw, hopefully breaking it free. There we go. We can set that screw aside. Now that the Phillips screw's out, our rotor usually comes off just like this. Sometimes you might need to hit it from the back or the front with the rubber mallet to break it free, but this one's free. So go ahead and take this right off. To remove our speed sensor from the knuckle, we're going to need to remove this bolt here. It's a 10mm. So we'll go ahead and remove that now. Oh, well, broke right off. So now that this bolt is broken inside the knuckle for our speed sensor, we're going to have to remove that speed sensor. By the looks of it, it's not going to come out in one piece. And we're going to try and lightly pry around this speed sensor to pop it up and out. There's probably a prong, a plastic prong sitting straight down at the length of this that's going to need to come straight out. And when the knuckle looks like this, there's a good chance it's not going to come out. So just take our time and see if we can get this to come out without breaking. And we can see now that the flange here is moving, but this block, that square block there, isn't moving at all. So we can see that our sensor is stuck in there. If you're taking your knuckle off to press out your bearing, you don't always need to take this bolt out. What you can do is come and follow this line backwards all the way back. There should be a bracket here, but ours is rotted off. And you'll find around the back side your plug. If you're a speed sensor, you can disconnect and remove the clips for this cable and take it off with your hub or with your knuckle. That's one way to go about this. The other way is to remove it from the knuckle. We're going to remove it from the knuckle. All right, so we're going to use a small pocket screwdriver towards the back where our bolt will go through. See if we can pry that up. Now, the way that this is moving and rotating, this cable here is pivoting around weird, means that we've actually broken free of the pin that's down inside the knuckle. So if we just pry this up now, it's broken at this point. So if we just pry this up now, you can see we have some broken plastic and then the center piece right here. All right, so you can see the bottom here. This is where this broken plastic is, and this is the center piece. So we're just going to continue to work this out, and then we'll deal with it once it's out. Okay, so this is our mounting plate, or our bolt flange here. We can move this up out of the way. We're still trying to remove the center piece out of the knuckle. At this point, we know everything's broken, going to need to be replaced. So we're just going to try and pry that out. When we take out our knuckle, we are going to drill out our old bolt and drill out our speed sensor here. So our speed sensor cable, I'm just going to move it out of the way. We know at this point we have to replace it. So we're going to use a pair of needle nose pliers to remove this wire clip here. And we can move that back and out of the way. And right here is going to be a 12mm bolt holding our brake hose to our strut assembly. We're just going to move that out of the way. Now underneath on our ball joint and our lower control arm here, it's going to be another point holding in our knuckle. We have a cotter pin on our castle nut. So our cotter pin typically is folded over. This one's straight out. So at this point, we're just going to try and force it back through and pull it out. And this is one of the parts. This cotter pin here will definitely be replacing. Anytime you pull one out, you definitely want to replace it with a new one. Now we can take our castle nut off of our ball joint. To remove our axle nut, we're going to have to remove the staking punched in on our axle. So we just have a small punch here. We'll just see if we can open that up enough to spin off the nut. Now all you want here is just enough to get that nut spinning. You don't need to make this perfect. This is also another one of these parts that you want to replace after removing is your axle nut. From here, we'll use a 36 millimeter socket on an impact to back that off. We're not going to take it all the way out just yet, but just to show you, that's the staking we had to undo. So we'll put this back on. Right about there. So the last thing we have is our ball joint down the bottom, which is going to be a 19 millimeter. And again, we're going to use our impact. And there's our castle nut. Now on our castle nut, we're actually going to take it and flip it backwards, spin it back on a couple of threads, and now what we can do is take a hammer and hit the ball joint from the bottom on the castle nut, not doing any damage to the ball joint itself. So now we have our two top bolts here holding our knuckle to our strut. The bolt head side is going to be a 19, and the nut side is going to be a 22. So we're going to leave at least one in there. We've decided it's going to be the bottom. At this point, it's actually pretty free. So from here, what we can do is take a small pry bar and we can pry our knuckle away from the strut. Before we do that completely, now we can remove our bottom bolt. Put a pry bar between the knuckle and the strut. We're going to hold our strut into place and pull our knuckle forward. One thing to take note of is you don't want to go too far forward if your axle is following. You don't want to separate your axle from the back side. So what we're going to do is now take our axle nut, back it off a little bit more. Give this a couple of taps, see if we can seat and push our axle backwards. Okay. I'm going to keep working that axle backwards until it comes out of the knuckle freely. All right, so the goal here now is to get your axle out of your knuckle. And we're just trying to separate the two here. Okay, once we have the axle free of the knuckle, I'm just going to pull it aside. Like that. So now that we have our axle out of the way, we can work on removing our knuckle or our ball joint from the bottom here. We're just going to continue to put some upward pressure on it with a sledge. So now that we've hit our castle nut and our ball joint straight up and broke the bond between here, we're going to take our 19 millimeter back off that castle nut. Okay, from here, we're going to move up top. We're going to take out that bolt that we just put in there. We're going to remove our knuckle, pull it out of the strut. We're going to lift out of the control arm. So now to remove the remaining pieces of our speed sensor, which you have to do if you're going to pull your bearing out, We're going to cut this flush. And the plastic here, which is also the plastic in the back of the sensor here that's stopping your bearing from coming out, we're going to remove this. What we'll try to do, see if we can work it out with a pair of pliers. Okay. The other option is flip it up, grab a punch, see if you can punch it outwards, back out. All right, so you can see we made no movement pushing it backwards. So outside of that, what we're going to do is drill it out. I'm going to grab a drill bit that fits the center opening there where the wires are. We're going to drill it out. Now, because we are replacing our bearing, we're not too concerned about doing any damage back here. If you are not replacing your bearing, be very careful coming through too far back here. You don't want to damage this black area or your magnetic pickup for your speed sensor. Again, we're going to keep trying to pick at this to remove it without drilling as much as possible. I'm going to step up one size. So we've punched now through the back, and what we see on the other side is the remaining piece of the speed sensor. So now we can pull that right out. What we're also going to do is just clean up inside there with a brush and a little bit of brake clean. So now that we've drilled it out, we've retapped it for a new bolt. So we've set up our ball joint press. Our ball joint is basically sitting in like this. We're going to press here, push our ball joint out of the knuckle. So inside where our ball joint is going to press into, we're just going to lightly clean in there. Make sure any rust or debris is gone the best we can. There's still going to be ridges in there from the ball joint being pressed in. You don't want to sand those completely flat, then you'll be opening up the hole too large. Alright, so now that it's clean and dry, we're going to wire brush across the top and the bottom. Take just a little bit of grease while we're here and have easy access. Just put a light coat on the back from any that we may have wiped off. And now we're ready to press our new ball joint in. I'm going to press in our ball joint, line it up as flat as we can to the surface. I'm going to give it a good squeeze just to hold it in position. So now our ball joint's in the knuckle, pressed in, nice and flush. So now we can put our snap ring on the base of our ball joint, and it's going to go just like this down the bottom. I'm actually going to spin it this side so make it a little easier to work. You guys can see. Just going to open this snap ring up. Sometimes these are a little finicky. All right, so you can see It's not fully seated on here. So just keep working it until the whole thing is flush. Sometimes all this is going to take is just a little push down, flathead screwdriver or your snap ring tool. Just open this a little bit and close it. Spin it. Take this side and just give it a push. Okay. On the end of our axle splines here that go into the hub or the knuckle, we're going to put a little bit of grease and we're going to put it into our new hub. Okay, at this point we can spin or rotate the knuckle itself. We're going to put our new axle nut on, a few threads. Now we're going to put our knuckle, we're going to put it into our strut first, raise up and locate our ball joint. So now what we're going to do is align our bolts. Now that we have our knuckle into our strut, push and align our bolts here. We're going to pull this back so we can start our bolt coming through. There we go. I'll put our nut on. I'm just going to snug this up. And now we can put our top bolt in. We're just using a pry bar on one side to kind of help us align the holes. And thread on our nut. And we're going to thread on our castle nut. All right, so our ball joint, castle nut, is going to be torqued down to 50 foot-pounds. And we're going to slowly creep up on this because we need to make sure that the cutouts on our castle nut line up to the hole in the ball joint stud so we can put our cotter pin through. Okay, now we can take our cotter pin, feed it straight through, separate that, bend it back on itself. Now with our suspension under load, we're going to tighten down our two strut to knuckle bolts. It's going to be a 19 on one side, a 22 on the other. We're going to torque them down to 116 foot-pounds. Now we're going to torque down our axle nut to 181 foot-pounds. We've lowered our vehicle close enough where we can put a big pry bar between the studs and the floor. And with the 36 millimeter, we'll torque it down. That should stop the rotation. All right, so now one last step is we will stake in this center here onto the axle to stop that nut from rotating. So now what we're going to do is we're going to stake down our axle nut into our axle, but to make it a little bit easier, we're going to use the handle of the hammer and rotate that stake point up and down. So we're just punching straight down. Okay. So now at this point, we're going to want to make sure that this hub surface is nice and clean and ready to receive the back of our rotor. This is actually very clean, but if yours needed a little bit more attention and it had some corrosion on there, you can get in there with a wire brush and clean up whatever you need to. If you need to use an air tool or lightly sand off some really heavy corrosion, you can do that. Ours just has some nasty grease and oil built up on here. We're going to hit it with some brake clean. Just give it a quick little dry, because what we're going to do from here is hit it with some anti-seize. We'll let that flash off for a minute and we'll come back with some anti-seize spray. So now we're going to use some anti-seize, but we're going to use it in an aerosol form. So instead of spraying everything in the general area, we're just going to use our paper towel here just to stop it from getting where it doesn't need to be. We're just going to put a light coat on our hub surface. So we're going to line up our Phillips screw holes. We're going to put it in place. And for this vehicle specifically, we only had one Phillips screw in our old rotor, so we're going to replace the one screw. So we're going to push our rotor in nice and tight. We're going to pick one of the two and put our Phillips screw in. I'm going to hold the rotor in place and we're going to tighten that down. Now we can take our caliper bracket and put it onto our knuckle, put our 2 bolts in. And again, these are going to be 17 millimeters. We're just going to snug these up, and we're going to come back and torque them down. So now we're going to torque our caliper bolts down to 79 foot-pounds. Now that our caliper bracket is torqued down, we can install our brake pads. We're just going to simply put the bottom tab into the metal slot, push down, and align the top and push into the rotor. Now that you have your pads in and squeeze nice and tight to the rotor, we have 2 last pieces of hardware. They're going to be these spring clips. There are holes on your brake pads. You're just going to squeeze these together and put them in the holes. Sometimes these want to fly out, so watch your eyes and be careful that they might want to run around the room. Okay, now our caliper has a piston inside that squeezes our brake pads. Our brake pads were a little thinner, they were used, so the piston is set out far enough where it needed to make contact. Our new pads are a little thicker, so we're going to have to push this piston back just a little bit more. We're going to use this compression tool to do that. You can use a C-clamp with a couple old pads or an old pad. The idea here is just to push this piston back into this area here as flat as possible, not at an angle. Now that we have our piston pushed back, we can release our tool. And now we can take our caliper, put it on our pads. I'm going to take it off of the hanger. Again, we're going to be careful not to stress the brake hose. Slide it onto our pads and into position for our bolts on the pins. Once it's in position, take one of the two bolts and thread it in place to hold our caliper. So with our two caliper bolts now snugged up by hand, you want to make sure on the bottom here, your caliper pins, the pieces that we greased earlier, you want to make sure they align with the caliper. There's a slot that those pins will sit into, which will stop the pin from spinning when you tighten these down. I'll make sure that's aligned. If it's misaligned, you may also not be able to get your bolt in. So we've got those both aligned, top and bottom. And now, with our 14mm socket, we can tighten these down to 25 foot-pounds. Now that we have our caliper installed, we had to press back our piston, which means now we're going to have to pump our brakes and bleed our brake line. We want to make sure we didn't introduce any air or anything into that line. Typically when you do this, you won't introduce any air because you haven't opened a line, but you have moved fluid far enough back where you want to make sure it's all the way forward and ready to go when you start and drive your vehicle. So to do this, we're going to use a 10mm socket. We're going to open up our bleeder screw. We're going to wait for some fluid to come out. We're going to look for no hesitation, no break, and no air bubbles in that line. Once we get that, we can close this back up, go up top of the vehicle, check our brake fluid level. We want to make sure that it's full to where it needs to be. If we need to add any, we'll go ahead and do that. So now, with a 10mm, we'll open this up. We'll check our fluid, make sure here we're not getting any breaks or air bubbles in the line. Looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and close it up and tighten it down. And again, once you're done with this step, you're going to want to go up top, check your brake fluid level, and if you're low, go ahead and add some. And one thing I like to do now that you've released some brake fluid out of here, is go ahead and hit it with some brake clean. Clean up any residual brake fluid that there may have been. What this will do is once this is dried up, it'll let you know if you have any leaks, because then you'll see a wet area. If you have any leaks, go ahead and address them. So now we can install our wheel. Sometimes when I'm having an issue centering or getting the wheel on nice and flat, I like to do a top nice and tight, push in, do a bottom nice and tight, and then rock back and forth till I get those two nice and tight. And that usually helps me get a wheel nice and flat. All right, now we can do the other ones. Come in here with our 19mm. Just snug these up. All right, now to torque these down, we're going to have to put the vehicle on the ground so the wheel doesn't spin. Now that our vehicle's on the ground, we're going to torque our lug nuts down to 80 foot-pounds. We're going to do it in a crisscross pattern. And then sometimes, if you really feel the need to, you can run around a second time just to make sure. Now at this point, you're going to want to take your vehicle down to a shop and have a professional alignment done. That's it.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.